Hi, friends. The lights are on and we are ready to go. Today's April 3rd. It's Friday. Some news has hit the waves, the whatever the digital waves, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. You know who I am. My name is Miss Hitch. I'm from TJ up in Alexandria, Virginia. Just your local friendly neighborhood AP government teacher here to talk to you today a little bit about the media. So we're going to be taking a look at some political cartoons, some primary source documents, some infographics to help us explain diverse media choices and how they influence our political knowledge. And you'll know that you've got it when you can successfully explain the messaging of a political cartoon. So today, we're going to be touching on a whole bunch of different topics that hopefully you've covered, things like presidential communication, the Bill of Rights a little bit, First Amendment freedom of speech. And we're going to be finishing up our skill set on source analysis, which is preparing us for next week when we launch into the fifth skill set, which is argumentation. And we'll be looking at diverse choices of media. So yeehaw. So I got a text, oh my gosh, at 2 o'clock that said, not a text, just kidding, a tweet saying, hey, let's talk about all of this news that just came down. And they want to know how's the best way to study and prepare. So let me talk a little bit about what we can talk about so far, and then we'll discuss the future. First of all, this is the announcement that's public facing about kind of what you can expect with the AP Gov test. It is Monday, May 11th, and it is all going on at the very same time across the country. So every AP Gov student who is taking this test will log in at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time to 10 a.m. Hawaii, which is the same time, and they will have 45 minutes to get through the test. That's 25 minutes for the argumentation FRQ, which isn't very long. That's 15 minutes shorter than what you would have had we not had the coronavirus. And then you have the content application FRQ, which is 15 minutes. So the rubrics are on their way out. And I know that they have touched down. If you are a teacher, they are posted. I definitely got a couple of emails with pictures of them. I will be spending next week giving resources to students that will assist students in completing the first FRQ, which is the argumentation. So please know that that will be posted in the comment section down below in that link. And we will be spending the next week and a half preparing students for that FRQ. Next week, I turn into Unit 1, and we're going to be breaking it down step by step, starting with how to write a thesis statement. So I've kind of cleared the deck in terms of making sure that we have enough time for you to get kids prepped both in this space and then also in your own space. The final calendar of pacing will be out next week. We wanted to have a little bit of time to be able to readjust once we had finalized versions of the rubric. So expect that next week to take us through May 1st. Okay. Yay. Okay. So back to minor factual error corner. So much fun. First of all, my friend Andrew wanted to let me know, wanted to affirm me that I got the Marvel universe correct. Thank you. I know that this is like fighting words when folks get the wrong universes associated with those folks. So thank you so much. The next question, or the next report of a minor factual error caught, was from Muthu once again, saying that I had a little bit of a snafu with viva voce, which should have been via voce. So thank you very much. Thank you for brushing me up on a little bit of Latin. I'm getting ready for that AP Latin test. All right. Great question number 1. From Brandon High School. This is Yusuf, who wanted to say hello to King Rosa. I'm assuming that's your teacher, I hope. Anyways, remember, we live in a democracy. We don't live in a monarchy. Wants to know how the coronavirus pandemic might affect voter turnout. And so this is a really fabulous question that a lot of you have asked questions about voter turnout. And I want to recognize that there's so many things that, since we don't have compulsive voting, it's not required by law, that every single time we even have like an adverse weather event, it decreases the likelihood that voters don't vote in future elections because it's a habit, because we get fulfilled by going and voting again and again and again. So it's not a great thing should we not be able to have, or since our elections are kind of being impacted potentially by the coronavirus. So what I do want to remind you is that absentee ballots, while they're not an Australian ballot, are absolutely possible for you to get your hands on. So because Yusuf asked me this question yesterday, I was like, let's make this a challenge. And on Twitter, teachers, students, you can join me. I've created I've like retweeted this one. And what we've done is we started posting, there's several people up there who shared the digital access, the digital URL to apply for the absentee ballots. Let's make this happen. I've already applied. It took me like 5 minutes last night. So I'm good to go because I have a primary coming up in June for my member of Congress's district. And, you know, every election matters, even the state and local. As a matter of fact, probably more so are those state and local elections. So get in on it. Let's go, folks. It's a challenge. My next question here is Tyler from Clarksville, Tennessee, wants to know the difference between fake and biased news, recognizing that we've heard the president refer to news companies like CNN as fake. And so it's a really great question because it's actually going to lend us into really beautifully into today's conversation. But in addition to that, we have to recognize, yeah, let's reiterate, fake news and biased news, they are not the same thing. They've been used interchangeably, which is a dangerous component here because it questions our reality, right? We're kind of getting into this whole postmodernism where we question the truth always, always, always. And at some point, we kind of have to have some place to come back to where we might be able to find out or uncover what the truth is. Now, fake news is 100% untrue. And in the comment section, in those links that I have, a description section, sorry, in the links that I have a lot of resources that I went and I found for you, like the News Literacy Project. There's some information there from NPR, that's doing some research that they did to find people in the United States who had constructed and were running a website that ran absolutely fake news, where it's not based in reality. It's not spinning with bias. It's not spinning with political kind of analysis, but we're talking about 100% untrue. So why do they do this? Because it's about ad revenue. The crazier the story, it's called clickbait. You guys know this. The more likely people will click on that clickbait, and the more clicks that you get, the more ad revenue that comes in. So CNN, yeah, they're biased. Like, I don't think I'm going to be telling you anything, and we're going to break this down today where it should shock you. CNN is a liberal media news resource. It is still covering factual information. They are just spinning it in a way that fits the bias of their viewing audience. And they may be covering the same facts. They may be maybe not covering the same facts, but Fox is going to do the same thing. And so is many of these news resources that are out there reporting on what's happening to us. Because with 24/7 news, there's only so many facts that we can get out. And so we spend a lot of time digesting that for the public through political commentary and op-eds. Okay, so we'll come back to that. First, I want us to go back to our passage that I left off last class with. So again, if you didn't get a chance to read this, that's totally cool. Pause the screen, read this, consider the things that I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to move forward. Remember, I had asked you yesterday to think about topic, position, evidence, and reasoning. So the topic here from this passage is the use of personal information by campaigns to mobilize voters. The position of the speaker is that Ted Cruz's app gathers a lot of personal information that enables campaigns to identify other potential voters. It's a really important component. Remember, we talked about what Get Out the Vote requires. It requires identifying potential voters, registering them to vote, and mobilizing them. So this app allows all three things to happen. And it's almost like a pipeline of information that's constantly there, because as you gamify this, it allows them to kind of spread out and identify new people. So evidence here. The excerpt talks about tracking the physical location. It talks about accessing contacts on your phone and on Facebook. It talks about combining this information with high-powered data analytics to identify potential voters faster and to mobilize them. So the reasoning part, how do we take these facts that are supporting the position? Because we're kind of like, remember, this is a thesis statement to some degree, right? They're taking a position. Remember, thesis statements are not restatements of facts. They are risky interpretations of factual information. So you need to step down, and then you need to get into what evidence can directly and logically support my argument in a way that is tailored to my argument. And then you need to get to the reasoning, which is your opinion on those facts and how those facts support your assertion, your evidence, your claim, your thesis statement, whatever your teacher might call it. So all of this information is collected digitally and ran through powerful computers, which enables a faster and more precise mobilization of potential voters. That's kind of the thing that we kind of take all of this. What would you do with this? How would this assist? And how would this enable campaign to get moving? So I wanted you to explain to me whether the use of personal data, because remember, we also need to connect it, right, to do some application, whether the use of personal data to mobilize voters increases or decreases representativeness of elected officials. And the interesting thing that's happening here is I'm asking you to weigh something, right? So we're looking increase or decrease. When someone asks me to weigh something, I'm going to make sure that I first and foremost put both categories on there. I want to be able to create a mental list that shows kind of the pros and cons or whatever the two competing interests, because I'm comparing before I go ahead and make any assertion or claim, which I don't have to here because I'm just explaining. So here what we're doing is explaining the use of personal data by the Cruz campaign increases the representativeness for voters who agree with Ted Cruz. That's one side. But it decreases it at the expense of all other voters. That's the other side. He's able to identify voters he can persuade to vote for him. He can identify issues that will be impactful in mobilizing. He can target them directly, right? So those are all things that are going to support and explain how it increases representativeness for some voters. However, I'm turning the corner. I put my turn signal on there. Anyone who is not in this camp will be ignored. This means representation for these individuals will decrease further as they are ignored, and therefore their ideas have no chance to compete. So we will, if I'm going too fast for you, remember, this is going to be the stuff of our dreams all next week and a little bit into the week after that. So prepare yourself. We're going to have so much fun because argumentation is my favorite. All right. An app. It's a form of media, isn't it? It brings us back to where we left off yesterday. So if we consent to sharing information, who cares? Why does this matter? What does it like? It's just enhancing our ability to know what the people want, right? Well, I want us to think about something for a minute, that our entire system of government is built on the idea of ordered liberty, right? We are sacrificing certain of our natural rights, or the full extent to which we have natural rights, in exchange for some kind of organized, ordered society. And that's generally done through rule of law, limited government, all these beautiful things that we talk about with the Constitution. It's best in the hands of a self-interested public, which means, again, we're getting back to Federalist 10, where all of our interests are competing on the daily level, right? And how do we make sure that we can know what is the best thing to do? We have to have a marketplace of ideas where we're debating, we're deliberating, we're turning over different facts, we're turning over different interpretations, we're having conversations, we're having dialogue, so that we get policy outputs, and this is critically important, good governance. I'm going to talk a lot about good governance next class, next Monday. So like, let's remember that word. It's one of my favorite AP Gov terms because it's not quite what you think. All right, so why would increasing diversity in media be a bad thing? If we're trying to have this marketplace of ideas where we're competing, isn't it good that we have this proliferation of things, places for us to go and have conversations? It's a great question. So let's think of news as all there is that we need to know that's important to our ability to self-govern. Are you with me? because that's the essence of democracy, is that we're self-governing. You and I are presented with information that can help us because we're active components in the gears of governance. We vote, we petition, we call, we write, we donate, we do all kinds of things, right? And in order to self-govern, we need to know all of the interpretations and perspectives on the truth. So let's put all of the true news out there into one single grain silo. I'm like kind of giggling because like I grew up in Cleveland. I live in Northern Virginia now. We don't have many silos, but if you don't know what that is, it's just a gigantic building that's there to harvest grain, right? And store it so it doesn't spoil. Believe it or not, it's involved in our food chain. Okay, how does our liberal press model help get this information to us? Because we're all engaged in this quest for self-governance. Well, we're a little bit different than other countries. Number one, we have a history that's rooted in something called the commercial press. I know when you've talked about the press in the past, you could tell me that they had these things called broadsides, which are newspapers, and they talked about political stuff. And you're right. But in addition to that, because our country is established on free market principles, the political press will very quickly, and when they mean political press, they're meaning a press that is there to espouse governmental positions, that is paid for by the government, so on and so forth, right? Commercial press can talk about politics, but it's owned privately, and therefore somehow it's going to kind of convey the impressions, the concerns, the needs of those owners and the community that they serve. Yes? Perfect. So these free market concerns, right, when you have newspapers, is going to drive competition for the news that's not subservient to the government. So at times it can be at odds with it. In addition to that, we actually have very limited state intervention. As of 2005, the largest intrusion was on the regulation of broadcasting. And it's less than 2% of the viewing audience in 2005. It's crazy, right? So we think, oh my gosh, like they're going to, they're going to put, a pause on live feeds and stuff like that. Like the amount of media that you and I consume where there's some kind of intervention, there's some kind of legal requirement is incredibly low, and it's getting lower every day. We have other intrusions that are out there, which we'll talk about, but they're limited by the First Amendment. And this final component is like a self-inflicted expectation. Self-inflicted makes it seem bad, right? But it's a requirement within the profession that journalists stay to the best of their ability, at least in the past, as politically neutral as possible, really like kind of throughout the 20th century. And in order to help them do this, they separated themselves from political attachments. Now things have changed, and so I want to like put an asterisk after this one because that one is kind of important. I want to also check in here, getting back to the question that we had at the top, is that, well, isn't this like fake news if it's not conveying the issues that, the government cares about? Well, remember, we have a commercial press, and because the commercial press has their own self-interest in exchanging information, that the news has always been vexing to those in power. As a matter of fact, during Washington's administration, there was two competing media outlets that interpreted the news in ways that were often incredibly frustrating to Washington. Washington was probably what we would consider at his time maybe more liberal. He tended towards big government solutions to some degree. However, he had Hamilton, who was a partisan. He had Jefferson, who was a partisan, and they had corresponding editors of commercially run newspapers who spent the entire time whipping everything into a frenzy, where they were taking their facts and they were putting a political analysis on it. And it's been problematic. I mean, because the government doesn't own the press, they cannot control 100% the message. So news media has evolved, right? We have these commercial broadsides. We remember the penny press and yellow journalism. Remember that they're also biased, but they reached more people due to advances in publishing technology and increasing literacy rates. We walked into this time period of objective journalism, which is around the middle of the 20th century, which sought to find the truth via investigative journalism in newspapers, radio broadcast, and broadcast television. I think of that as just the facts, man. So what we have here, especially in the turn of the century, 20th century, I'm sorry, the 20th century, mid 20th century with his objective news, is that you have this silo of truth, right? And from the silo of truth, we're getting a liberal stream and we're getting a conservative stream. Now, the interesting thing that happens here is like we're still getting the facts, and there will be some spinning of those facts to fit the needs, to fit the biases of the public that is consuming that media. But what we really do see, and I want to make sure we understand this, is that there were vibrant press outlets, the Black press, the Hispanic press, so on and so forth, who were working for their community, but they, because they were minoritized communities and they had structural barriers that were in front of them, had a very hard time taking their message and getting it into the mainstream. So that's, we have like quote unquote the truth, right? And the truth does exist for these minoritized communities. It's just the messaging isn't getting there. And so that can be frustrating. Right. And then yesterday, I talked to you a little bit about some things that have caused a restructuring within the news media, right? That we've got this demise of objective reporting in favor of political commentary, that we've got this shrinking universe of newspapers and other traditional forms of media in form of digitized media, especially social media. We've got a rise in these big, gigantic companies that own several mass media platforms or conglomerates like Disney. We've got narrowcasting, and I'm going to talk a lot about narrowcasting right now, and some of the things that come with narrowcasting, like sound bites, horse race journalism, and media events. So let's turn and look to that right now. So today, we still have siloed truths, but they're kind of half truths, right? We're like sorting out the truth before it even gets to where it needs to be. So we take the truth and we bifurcate it, and it's going to go into the liberal sphere and the conservative sphere. And what they're going to report and spin doesn't even necessarily add up. They're not reporting about the same concepts. I mean, this morning I went, and this is an interesting experiment. I just want you to go look at the headlines, because all of the headlines right now between CNN and Fox are about, for the most part, coronavirus. I spent maybe a half an hour this morning before I got up looking at that. And I really want you to look at not just how are they talking about the coronavirus, but what are they reporting on? What is the thing that makes the headlines? Most Americans don't read past the headlines. So if all you're doing is you're skimming these two websites, what is your truth about the coronavirus? And I just, even if you want to do that now, just take a moment to go check it out. It's pretty astounding. So because we're taking these half truths, we're really having a hard time agreeing on what that truth is, because we're getting completely different information. And it's really, really hard when that reporting, in addition to that, is completely divorced from the truth. So you see those two little guys down there on the bottom who have their megaphones and they're pointed up? Those guys aren't even connected into our silo of half truths. They're completely making stuff up. That's our fake news, right? They have nothing in there. What they're saying is grounded in reality. That's like people photoshopping images. That's being able to slow down videos to make people sound like they're intoxicated or inebriated. That's taking things out of, and splicing media together. That's voiceovering things with impersonators. Like all of those things make it very difficult for us to understand what's happening so that we can self-govern. And it's truly dangerous. So I really love Ad Fontes Media. Teachers, I'm sure that we all use this. I don't know if you've been to see this website recently. Even if you're a student, they've really, really done a lot to develop this, and you can buy a licensed copy of this to use. And I want to say thank you to them, because this is a beautiful resource that I purchased from them. So this tells us, and they do a lovely job. There's an interactive version of this that talks about where our media is on kind of truthiness, right? On this spectrum of what we can trust and what we cannot trust. And while it's interesting to note what's at the top, right, where we can trust, I want you to notice that it is a definitive pattern here, that the more truthful it is, the more you see convergence, where you really don't see a ton of bias, because they're reporting on kind of like the standard, like the full stream. But as we come out, right, on either side, that's where we're getting these distorted perceptions of what reality are. And so where does this come from? This comes from, yes, like if you want to say it's going to come from the media's outlet and the ownership and all that stuff, 100%. In particular, I think of Remember the Maine, when we had the Spanish American War, and the press in New York City completely fabricated the idea, of how the Maine sunk to start the Spanish American War. Absolutely, bias walks in the door through the people who are paying the paychecks of those who are reporting. Yes, it becomes from the people who are making decisions about what runs. Those are our editors and reporters. It comes from, conglomerates, from being able to kind of spread their tentacles and control more and more of what we're consuming. But oops, this is a double copy here, so I'll have to fix this. Somebody's gonna check me. Minor factual error. What should it say down here on this one side, Ms. Hitchcock? Because it's like double. The most important component of this is that the bias comes from the consumers. That the news media is not going to run stories that is going to, like, if I'm CNN, I'm not going to run stories that are far to the right, something that you might see on InfoWars or Twitchy, because people will turn the television off. And if I'm Fox, I'm not going to run stories from Occupy Democrats as legitimate truth, because all of my Fox viewers will turn it off. And if they're turning their television off, then those individuals who have bought time on those networks to advertise for whatever it is, breakfast cereals or whatever it is that they're advertising, are spending money on influencing nobody. And this is that whole commercial thing. So what we see here is that narrowcasting, or this idea that we're talking to two separate publics. It's coming from our gatekeepers, it's coming from our leadership, but it's also coming from us, the consumers. We're reinforcing this. If every liberal is only watching CNN and every conservative is only watching Fox News, then this is the reality that we are going to set the table for. This is what they are going to reinforce, because this is what gets eyeballs to watch the ads that make the revenue for these commercial press outlets. Okay. Some more, like, just kind of like get down in this is super interesting. This is from Gallup, talking about trust and accuracy in news. I find this amazing that we still believe above all other forms local news, right? But we kind of like look at the disparate, right? Nightly news on ABC, CBS, and NBC, 79% of Democrats, but only 35% of Republicans. Because of this perception and because of the confirmation bias that we seek out as a viewing public, to hear what we want to hear the spin that we're traditionally used to. Just a really fascinating thing for us to take a look at. Again, look at Fox on the Republican side at 69%, Democrats coming in at 30%. Look at CNN at 72% for liberals and 20% for Republicans. We just want to sit on the side of the stadium that our home team is on. We do not want to hear anything from the other side. So even the local news media can be biased. As much as we believe there are conglomerates out there that are amassing these huge, multi-platform networks like Sinclair Media, where when they're doing that, Sinclair is going to start to pull up the biases of parent corporations. Gray will do the same thing. I mean, it's the same cycle here, right? And how does this impact our ability to trust the news in general? Well, if you are hearing from the people that are in your atmosphere who are saying things like, don't trust the news, like you can't trust this side or you can't trust this side, then it's going to decrease our ability to be able to figure out what reality and truth are, which matters because we're self-governing. And in order for us to self-govern, we have to have access to the truth. And while the truth can be interpreted differently, we need to have all of those things at our disposal. And like I said, we're not there. It's super interesting to me that this quote comes out of the early 1800s from Alexander Addison. To mislead the judgment, the late 1700s, to mislead the judgment of the people where they all have the power. That is a Republican style democracy. So talking very much so about our form of government, must produce the greatest possible mischief, because we have all been led astray in terms of what truthfulness is for the purposes of self-governance. And I want to remind you, we're going to talk so much more next week about this, that tyranny exists in every form of government. And I'm going to share like one of my favorite, I love the Constitution. So we're going to talk about it next class, where our founding fathers specifically pointed out that every single form of government, whether it be autocracy, oligarchy, or democracy, can be this philosopher king, this enlightened version that seeks a public interest, or it can be a tyranny that seeks self-interest. And what is the tyranny of democracy? Demagoguery. Should look up that word. It's a fun one. All right. Can the government do anything about this? Of course, right? We have the First Amendment, right? So when we talk about First Amendment, I want you to recognize that that's not an unencumbered right to say whatever you want in any situation. This is a contract between you and the government only. And there are certain things that we have carved out and said, we don't value this kind of speech. And if we want to understand why, it's because it's the truth for self-governance. It's something that our Supreme Court has come back to time and time again, that we need to have truthful information for the practices of self-governance. So things like low value speech, like true threats, obscenity, defamation of character, and fighting words, we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks. That's not valuable speech. When the speaker has a special relationship with the government, like he's an employee, that doesn't count, right? You have your working as more than just a private individual. When you have content neutral exceptions like restrictions on noise or blocking traffic or large signs where you're not going after the message, but somehow the way that it's conveyed, we can go ahead and say that there could be content neutral exceptions and we can limit those things. Seditious speech, like threatening to overthrow the government, we have a large history of limiting that, although it was controversial even at the time. And national security risks, things like prior restraint, which again, I'm going to talk about in a couple of weeks. So we do have, in order to help us with these kinds of things, you see some of these ideas threaded through what the FCC is there to do. The Federal Communications Commission, otherwise known as the FCC, is an independent regulatory commission made up of a board of individuals who are balanced for political issues, who are kind of separated a little bit from political pressure and the way that it's structured. They're there to regulate TV, radio, internet, and broadband, kind of, sort of. And what they're there to do is prevent monopolies, like that's a content non-specific issue. They're there to look at the goals and performance of stations that are under licensure, because licensure, like the call letters, right, like WKROK, KROC, or whatever, those are all things that are the license is given by the government because the airwaves are public property, right? But if we're talking about cable or subscription radio or anything like that, that is unlimited in the number of options that we have because of the technology, whereas we only have a certain amount of wavelength that can be used for radio and television technology. And the other thing here is we have issued fair treatment rules in terms of broadcast media for candidates and office holders. So they regulate these public wavelengths. We've got three significant things that are out there, things like the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcasters to devote some airtime to discussing controversial matters of public interest and to add contrasting views. So that's like, if you want to talk about anything that has to do with politics, you have to present both sides, and that has been gone since 2011. Now, what still remains is something called equal time, in which if you allow one candidate to speak, you have to allow another candidate to speak, right? If a Democrat gets on the television, then you have to have the same basic environment and time length for our Republican person as well. And then there's also something, a right of reply rule, that's there to prevent someone who's been personally attacked. They have the right to respond on that same platform. So it's critical that we're all informed of the truth and provided perspectives. And now we know why, right? Now, the political branches are also going to be airing things, right? Like they don't own, with the exception of things like Voice of America and PBS and NPR, which are different. We'll talk about that later. The broad kind of scope of what's happening in the news media is, like we know, it's commercial media. And so the president and Congress, they're going to be trying to capture the attention and capture the inquisitiveness of the American people. When the president is using any kind of media platform to be able to capture public attention for the purposes of persuading on some agenda that the president might have, they're using what we call the bully pulpit, things like fireside chats, State of the Union addresses, Reagan's televised addresses. One of my favorite things, which is like came from the West Wing and Andrew Sorkin, but actually came from Andrew Jackson, was called the Big Block of Cheese Day, in which we have this like government transparency. You can tweet with members of the Obama administration. We don't do that under the Trump the Trump era, but Trump's use of Twitter certainly is involved in this, right? They are going to conduct, they also have staff that are there to help them persuade the public on the regular, who are speaking for the president, like the press secretary, who has press briefings that occur regularly because they haven't been occurring regularly under the Trump era. You have presidential addresses, which are much more formal, one-sided conversations. A press conference, we've seen a lot of those out of President Trump recently, which are a Q&A where he has his talking points and then he is going to accept questions from the press. Trial balloons are really important things. They'll test out information to see if it's favorable with the American public. An example of a trial balloon would be right down here in the bottom. You see this guy, Donald Trump has reportedly selected Mike Pence, right? That's intentionally coming out of the Trump administration. They're just trying it out to see what people say. Are they like, oh my God, yay? Or are they like, oh, and they kind of make determinations about that. And then one of my favorite things are media events. Those are like political theater when they show up, right? If we're talking about huge increase in the amount of jobs, you might see the president giving a press conference at a manufacturing place. That's all, you know, it's all fabricated as like nice backdrop, just like you would see on, you know, in a movie, right? It's the right setting to be able to prove your point. Now, Congress had to do this too, but because there's so many of them, they have a harder time capturing the media or the attention of the media. So they are going to rely on things like media events, town halls, social media outreach, and sound bites, where they're going to craft language that's maybe, you know, 15 to 30 seconds long. You know it when you see it. It's kind of, I hate using a standard from the Supreme Court, where you just kind of feel like they've been waiting for this. I think of Hillary Clinton during the debates with then candidate President, or now President Trump. She said things like trumped up trickle down economics. You could tell that she spent a lot of time kind of researching with polling how that would resonate with viewers. She wants it to be a buzzword. She wants it to be in headlines. She wants it to be a hashtag, because it doesn't really tell us a lot. There's not a lot of substance, but for whatever reason, it resonates with us and it makes a splash. And a lot of this is like the adversarial relationship with the press, right? So, you know, this an interesting component here with taking a look at a passage, and I want you to think about this because it's going to help us when we get to our political cartoon in a second. So you go ahead and feel free to pause this. I want you to read this. I'm going to move ahead because I know what it says already, and I'm going to pick up on the next slide. So see you in a second. All right, so our guided practice here, hopefully that passage helps to contextualize the adversarial relationship that Nixon had even before Watergate with his relationship with the press. There was a lot of, you know, second guessing, a lot of criticism, so on and so forth. And so I think it's an interesting contextualizing way for us to take a look at this political cartoon from that time period. So when you see political cartoons or maps or infographics, there's kind of like a 7-step process that I want you to work your way through, which I'm going to replicate with you. And again, this would be a great point for you to pause and to think of, maybe like jot it down on a piece of paper. I'm going to move ahead and start answering these questions. So again, I'll see you in a minute. Okay, so our first question here is there any text in the image, any vocabulary words? And I know this is so easy, like this is just, can I read, right? But it's important because we're thinking, I want you to like look on the 4 corners of that image to see if you can pull out all of the nuance that you would see in images. So the text that we see is Watergate, Flack, ITT, Vietnam, inflation, and crime. And down there at the bottom next to the little bull, the name of the artist, it says he's flying above it all, and it's titled Out of Range. So I get this feeling that there's like war, something like that. Do we see any caricatures of political figures that you recognize? And of course, the answer is yeah, it's Richard Nixon. We know that at the time that this was published in 1972, it's a little less than a month before the re-election of President Nixon, and he is the incumbent running for office. Are there any symbols or vocabulary words that we would need to know? Absolutely. He's a president. We know that. Number 2, incumbent. He's running for re-election. And then the words kind of feel like the symbolism, I feel like they're bombs exploding, right? So these headlines, they feel a lot like headlines or sound bites like, boom, here you go. Boom, Watergate. Here, boom, Vietnam. You don't need to know meat prices and wheat deal, maybe even ITT, to get a feel that maybe these are controversial at the time. All right. Do we have any symbols or images in political? I'm sorry, there's like a window in the way. So I'm going to have to like skip over that part. But Nixon looks like he is flying with his hands out as wings, doesn't it? It looks relatively relaxed, even though there's headline bombs exploding beneath him. So it feels like his ability to use the bully pulpit, he can kind of find a way to spin and withstand criticism from the press. Like those headline bombs can't reach him at the altitude that he's cruising at. And he just looks so smug or confident, depending, right? Semantics matters, kind of the word you use to color it. That it's just not going to like obstruct his ability to kind of maneuver these issues. So does it have a bias? And so this is why, like, especially when you go through this in sequence, I think it's really helpful because it helps you step down into further analysis. So while Nixon looks smug, it can also be a reference to his experience in the military during World War II. He was a pilot. I'm sorry, he wasn't actually my, so someone can do an MFE on me because I'm thinking he was a pilot, but at least he was flying around somewhere because of island hopping, right? Or he was in the Navy. I know. Okay, whatever. Okay, so he is finding this calming, like maybe he's been here before. The stress of being around adverse situations is something that doesn't really get him down, right? And they're not damaging his abilities. But it's interesting when I look down at the bottom that the bull next to the illustrator seems surprised or baffled that these accusations aren't impacting his success. So maybe the person who wrote this, maybe he's a Democrat. But when we took a little bit further, the emotional or intellectual reaction that the artist is trying to elicit, maybe the headlines are from some of those headlines would be things that we would expect from liberals, political corruption in Watergate and Vietnam. But we also see some things that tie back to conservative values like crime and inflation. So it's probably more along the lines that he's trying to point out it's surprising that no criticism from liberal or conservative is damaging Nixon's reelection bid. So it's more likely that it's just kind of like a wide ranging criticism from both sides against maybe his suitability as a candidate, so on and so forth. All right, so summarize what we're trying to do. This is that risky part where we're kind of taking all of the facts and we're going to turn them into an opinion. Nixon's confidence in himself might be dangerous, seeing that he is taking shots from conservatives and liberals alike. He may not find that he is as, since this is before the election, that his reelection is guaranteed. All right, let's do a check for understanding. So which of the following describes a consequence of the growing concentration of ownership of the news media? A, newspaper prices have gone down. B, coverage of political events has gotten more liberal over time. C, prices for televised campaign ads have gone down. Or D, there is an increased similarity of network news coverage. The answer is D. I'm sure you got it. Absolutely. Right? Okay. Number two, remember, so like this, we're talking about this is getting at conglomerates. So I know that you want to say that we have more narrow casting, but in addition to that narrow casting where we're getting different truths, we're focusing on what impact does ownership have on the type of news media that we're consuming. And if I buy increasingly larger media monopolies, you're getting fed the same meal, right? Even though narrow casting is happening at the same time. That's my opponent over there, the narrow casting. Two, which of the following is a true statement about the role of the media in providing citizens with information? A, investigative reporting dominates the news because it's less expensive than political commentary. B, demand for instantaneous news reporting has led to the growth of 24-hour news operations and a shift to online media consumption. C, the media is increasingly controlled by the major political parties who determine which stories are covered by the press. Or D, there's been an increase in social media and internet news consumption by the public, causing the top 5 media conglomerates to have greater control over public opinion. Did you get the answer? Of course you did. It's B, 24/7, right? We want to be entertained all the time. Okay. 3, which of the following provides the most accurate explanation of how consumer-driven media increases partisan polarization? A, it tends to avoid discussing controversial, words are hard. Avoid discussing controversial political topics. It reinforces existing political biases in individuals. It relies heavily on corporate advertising. Or D, it's overwhelmingly conservative. So we're looking for the best answer that's the most true in most situations here, and the answer there is B, right? It's reinforcing. Okay. Okay. Although C is a great answer, we're looking at, partisan polarization. We want to know corporate advertising isn't necessarily going to help us understand partisan polarization. So here it is. Take a look at our summary. Did you get it? Were you able to successfully explain the messaging on the political cartoon, or do you feel like you're moving in that direction? Did you have a good time looking at visual elements like cartoons, maps, and infographics? And do you feel like you understand how the media influences our political knowledge? I hope so. All right. Your homework for tonight, should you choose to accept this challenge from me, is take a look at this. So this is going to go back and it's a little bit of a summary from Unit 5 since we're now officially done with Unit 5 and we're moving on to review next week. So make sure you get a snap of that. That is also available on the description section in the links. And I just want to take a moment because this morning I was walking and I really wanted to, I was thinking about just kind of like how beautiful it is that I get to see spring unfold in a way that I really haven't to. And like that's silver linings. But I also recognize that we are all going through dramatically, infinitely stressful times in every single community across our country in ways that we really couldn't fathom before. And so I recognize that my ability to do something as fleeting as walk in my community is because of the unending sacrifice and personal commitment from my heroes in the community who are even more illuminated today than they would be. So I want you to help me. Let's give a standing ovation for our medical professionals who care for us physically and emotionally. Let's give a standing ovation to people who are involved in producing, shipping, and distributing food and essential supplies, and our community leaders making tough calls about our well-being, our fire and police who are making us safe in our communities, and our teacher and educational professionals who are providing love, guidance, support, and instruction despite the chaos of coronavirus. You have the weekend off. Wish you the very best. Please make sure that you make a commitment to think about all the things that are important in your life, because remember, you are more than a test. And I will see you back here on Monday. Remember, if you're having problems with the device and internet access, please, please, please let us know. We want to help you. cb.org/tech. I'm so excited to see you on Monday when we start talking about argumentation and we talk about Unit 1. And here are all of my resources. And I'm out. Bye.